Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. I'm David Shaw with Family Business Magazine, and I hope that you and your family members are all doing very well. Today's webinar is the third in a four-part series of sessions on mastering liquidity strategy. Our first sessions looked at the timing of and the structuring of liquidity. This session takes a different approach, looking at how you can scale your family business and build a family office and liquidity at the same time. But before we get started, a few housekeeping details. If you haven't been to one of our webinars before, there will be time for questions. You can ask them using that bar underneath the slide that you see there where it says ask a question. This webinar will go for no more than 30 minutes, and I think you'll enjoy this quite a bit. Let's get to our speakers. This is the third series of webinars that we've done with Interchange Capital Partners, Ami and Brian Baum, who have undergone their own generational transition and have used their experiences to inform the content of these sessions. Brian is now CEO and president of Interchange Capital Partners, and Father Ami has stepped away from day-to-day operations to assume the role of executive chairman. So I welcome both of you, Ami and Brian.
Pleasure to be here, as always.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
You bet.
So for those of you that have not seen one of these before, my name is Brian Baum. I am the president and CEO of Interchange Capital Partners. And we work exclusively with closely held multi-generational family businesses before, during, and after a transition of ownership. From a before perspective, we're really focused on the business consulting, entity structuring, family advisory. During, it's all around creating liquidity and executing on whatever that transition of ownership is. And then after, it's really focused on building, empowering the family office, the private wealth strategy, and the cash flow strategy for the families long term. Ami, do you want to talk a little bit about the Clarity Foundation that we walk families through and how that impacts them?
Sure. I think part of the challenge is, and everyone on the call knows this on the webinar, when you're dealing with in a family business, is the four interchanges. The interchange of yourself, your family, your business, and your ownership. And it's through that complexity that the Clarity Foundation has its opportunity, because that complexity creates all kinds of challenges. So the first part, and again, most people who are very successful tend to want to move into action. So when you get anxious or stressed, you say, well, let me control something, let me get moving into action. And too often what we have found over the decades of doing this work is by moving first into action, all kinds of problems start to arise. So we backed everything up and said, let's start from the beginning and let's make sure we're clear. Let's make sure that not only you, your family, your employees, all your stakeholders, your ownership has a real clear vision of where it is that you want to go over the next 3 to 5 years or whatever time period that is. At the same time, once you have determined where you want to go, the next part of clarity is to try to figure out, well, what are the obstacles? What are the things that are going to prevent you from getting there? And then, of course, opportunities that you want to be able to capture. And probably one of the more underutilized aspects of the Clarity Foundation is your special sauce. What are the strengths? What are the things you bring to the table? Again, you, your family, your business, and your ownership that really you want to continue to develop. So once you have that clarity, then it becomes clear where the gaps in understanding are, where the gaps in modeling are. So the understanding component, you may have people within your family that need further education along certain areas. You might need certain types of understanding as it relates to modeling out certain types of entity structures or cash flows, certainly your ownership. Once that's put together, then you can finally move that into action. And so basically, the Clarity Foundation sits under what we call our enterprise control architecture. doing things by design, not by accident. Right?
So over the next 30 minutes, we are going to tackle two primary questions that we hear consistently. The first is, can you extract liquidity from the business while still accelerating growth? And the second is, can you build towards a diversified family office without strangling the operating company that got you there? Most of the time, the owners we talk to assume the answer to both of these questions is no, that it's either liquidity or it's growth, and I have to view it as a trade-off. Our answer today is actually yes to both of these, if you design it correctly. So that's the whole session that we're going to focus on. It's not liquidity as an exit. It's not liquidity as a retirement event, but liquidity that's engineered for the next stage of growth within the family business and the family ecosystem at large. So here's what you're going to walk away with. We're going to talk about the growth paradox solve, when liquidity extraction actually can accelerate rather than constrain business growth. We're going to talk about capital allocation frameworks, deciding what stays in the business versus what's going to move to the family office investment strategies. Family office readiness indicators, when you've built and defined a scale to justify that infrastructure and what you need to do to reach that threshold. We're going to talk about liquidity as growth fuel. So partial exits, recaps, asset harvesting to fund expansions, acquisitions, and market opportunities, and then building towards scale. The liquidity and the structural decisions that are going to create the optionality for significant future events. So the question isn't liquidity or growth. It's how do we sequence and size a liquidity event so that it removes pressure without removing the capital the business needs. That's a design problem. It's not a binary choice. So before I kick it over to Ami to talk through the growth paradox, I just want each of you to silently note one liquidity decision your business or your family is currently avoiding. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Ami, do you want to take us through the growth paradox?
Sure. So let's name this paradox directly. Founders, and I'm obviously a founder, we're told two contradictory things. We have to diversify, take some chips off the table, and reduce our risk. But the business itself also needs to reinvest everything, and we don't want to starve the growth. Those two voices, those two pieces of advice feel like they're pulling in opposite directions, and most of us for a long time have felt that way. Well, we're here to reframe that and let you recognize that liquidity, extraction, and growth acceleration aren't opposites. When the liquidity event is structured well. So again, as we've said, this isn't a binary choice. This is a design issue. So we've seen distributions actively increase enterprise value. Well, how's that possible? Well, because it reduces family pressure on the business. Anyone who's been involved with the family recognizes that with all the stakeholders that make up a family business, family ownership, there's a lot of pressure. And so with being able to create some distributions, all of a sudden frees up some of that enterprise value. So when a founder's entire net worth is trapped in one illiquid asset, and I'm guilty of that, as anyone who's read my blogs know that. And the reason for it is because every time I look at other places to invest, my best returns come from the company that I started and we're building. So it's not that it was by design, but it's still creating a challenge because every decision and every capital allocation call, every acquisition, every hire has to get filtered through, candidly, my own personal financial anxiety, about this. As much as everything's great and wonderful, there is that. So this anxiety shows up as underinvestment, which we have obviously not done. So we've learned our lessons, but for some of you, you may not have learned those lessons, and too much caution and delayed decisions, which we haven't done, but you may find yourself in that. So once a family has some liquidity outside the business, even a modest amount, that pressure releases. Owners become bolder. They're better timed decisions because the business no longer has to carry the entire weight of the family's financial security. And again, the families that have more generations, you understand this even better than most. That's the paradox, and it's solved. The extraction event is what unlocks that courage to grow. You want to give us an example of that, Brian?
Yeah, it's funny. Not us. No. I'll save us for this one. I had a different one, but I was with a friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about some major decisions that happened in his family business. And this company paid out really, really nice dividends on a regular basis. And they just made the decision to exit the entire family company. And him and I are together, and we're just kind of rehashing what actually occurred. And I said, you probably had the same opportunity with the same buyer, maybe a decade ago. And I'm pretty sure that the number overall was much higher then. And he looked at me, he goes, yeah, it was. Like, I know that it was much higher then. And it got both of us talking and thinking, like, there was so much dividend distribution, but there was always this greater desire for liquidity. And him and I were talking, and I said, look, there could have been ways to engineer that liquidity based off of key moments in time. One of those was a passing of a very large shareholder. The company had more than enough capital to buy a very, very large, like hundreds of millions of dollars of life insurance, and potentially offer that large shareholder a full buyout upon that person's passing away. Who knows what that could have done from a liquidity perspective, from the noise in the room, but that pressure could have been released, and it could have given more optionality for those that want to stay in to have capital from an event like that to be able to continue to support both sides, not only the growth and the desire to stay in, but also the very real, raw emotional need for liquidity. And I think whenever you start taking it that step further, you start looking and saying, well, really all this is, it's just a constraint that I have to work within. And
so let's leave you with this thought. Can you identify one or more growth decisions that you or your business has delayed purely out of personal financial caution rather than operational necessity? These are the kinds of things that start to begin that clarity, which begins the understanding, and then you can move forward into the action. You want to talk a little bit about capital allocation, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first place that we have to look at is we got to be looking at this from a full balance sheet perspective. And we touched on this the last time, but most of the time the owners are only ever looking at the business balance sheet, what it can do, what it can access. We ask different questions across everything that the family owns: operating company, real estate, investment accounts, insurance, even underused, lazy business assets. And we're really focusing on what should stay working within the company and what should be moved into a separate family office strategy. So there's a very useful concept here, and we call it lazy assets, but it could also just be, what are the things that are owned that are not core to how your business wins in the marketplace? These are assets that are sitting around, and they're not earning their keep. They were purchased, they're there, but they're not doing really anything. It's also excess cash sitting in an operating account, earning next to nothing, under-leveraged real estate, a life insurance policy that's never been optimized, receivables that could be factored. The lazy assets can often just be activated for liquidity without touching into the operations at all. And I'm willing to bet that there's probably 5 to 10 to maybe even 15% that are sitting in places that could be looked at. So when you do this, you got to bucket these into 3 capital buckets. So the first one is, this has to stay in the business: working capital, growth, CapEx, strategic reserves. Bucket 2 is, this is available to extract. It's capital that genuinely is available without harming operations, often larger than owners assume once they're identified. And then bucket 3 is going to be conditional. You could go either way. And the decision depends on the growth opportunity that is in front of you that specific year. So the output of this exercise is not going to be a single number. It's going to be a decision framework. that you can use every single year. It's a repeatable process, not a one-time event. And critically, we need to design the cash flow system so that both sides actually work together. The business has a predictable, protected capital base, and the family has a predictable distribution or draw schedule. So that's how you can think about the full family balance sheet method and how you can actually start driving it into practice as well. On a family office readiness indicators, I think a lot of owners hear family office and they automatically think that like that's the goal. It isn't, and it really shouldn't be. And frankly, it's not for everyone. In building a family office, the infrastructure too early, it's just going to add a ton of cost and complexity without enough scale to justify it. You may even pull a child in that you're trying to force into the company and say, hey, go run this family office. And that doesn't exist. And all that is going to do is kill their career and potentially damage relationships. And we've seen that happen a number of times too. So how do you know if you're actually going to be ready? There's a few indicators that we look for and we found are common. There's a complexity of the assets. You're managing more than 2 or 3 or even 4 distinct asset types outside of the business where informal tracking starts to break down. The number of decision makers, once it was just, your spouse, adult children, or multiple family members, they're now all involved in financial decisions. You have needed shared infrastructure, and it's not just one person's spreadsheet. This really shows up whenever there's a very robust cap table in terms of ownership. And then the final one is if you do envision that there's either a very large liquidity event on the horizon, or the company has gotten to such a point where the distributions have been increasing every single year substantially, and it's getting out of control from what should we be doing, how should we be doing it. Those are the steps. But I would even take it one step further that say, 90% of the people on this call probably have what's known as an embedded family office. You're leveraging your operating company today. At some point in the future, that has to shift. If you bring in a strategic investor, they're almost going to require that you start separating those two parties out, because they're going to want you to focus on growing that business, not handling all of this. But also through technology and everything, like it's not as necessary any longer to go the single family office route. And at the end of the day, you're just building another company that you then have to manage yourself.
Right. And one of the things about family offices is because they are, quote, the shiny new object, and everybody wants that, people forget to do ROIs. The costs that people spend on family offices are significant. And not only the increase in cost, but then you get what is called mission creep. All of a sudden, you start doing this and that, and before you know it, your returns on your investments are being nicked 3 to 5% annually, just based upon the cost of running these. So not that the concept of family office, of an integrated collaborative approach for all stakeholders and family members, certainly with different generations and different needs, is extremely valuable. But there are alternatives now to the traditional family office for it. So I appreciate the the new, shiny new object, but mitigate that a little bit. Once again, go back to the Clarity Foundation. What are you trying to accomplish? And then make sure it's modeled out appropriately so that you can take the correct action.
Yeah, absolutely. So an action item to leave you with on this section: score your own readiness against these 3 indicators. How complicated, are the assets? How many decision makers are there? And is there a horizon of significant liquidity events? That should help you to see, how do you design what you're ultimately looking for and what's going to serve you and your family. All right, so Ami, let's talk a little bit about the last couple of sections of this, which are, how do we take liquidity and turn it into growth fuel, and how do we really start building towards scale?
Yeah. So in terms of bringing it back to growth, Once you've identified the extractable capital, there's several structures that turn it into the fuel rather than ending it. And partial exits, obviously, selling a minority stake to a strategic or financial partner will bring in outside capital, and often, which is even more valuable, some outside expertise, while you keep control and all the upside. There's obviously recapitalizations where you pull cash out today against the value that you've already built without selling anything. You can use that to fund acquisitions, a new location, a market expansion, and that the business couldn't otherwise afford. And then obviously asset harvesting, activating those lazy assets that Brian talked about. Those can fund growth without adding new debt or giving up any equity at all. And that goes back to that full balance sheet. Too many people go back, as I started at the beginning, they go to one place that they can solve. And what we're trying to get everyone to do is to, in order to be able to engineer this properly, you have to look at the entire balance sheet, that full balance sheet. Right?
So it's important to remember that each of these, and really a lot of the things that we talk about on these webinars, like they're just one lever to pull. It's not a finish line. And the families who ultimately are scaling to very significant, outcomes of, 9 and 10 figure valuations for their businesses, they're using these levers repeatedly, and they're using them deliberately across not only their business, but also the family lives, and not just one time at the end. And I think that that's a really important aspect of this. Each of you have a family company or are close to a family company, and that asset has powered the growth and the proliferation of the family for potentially decades. That can continue, but you have to figure out how to solve all of these monumental catalysts, because those, when not solved, when buried under the rug, that is going to cause all the issues that we consistently hear from a business perspective. And when we think about this, really what we're talking about is you got to build towards scale. So really the last idea that we want to leave you with is a series of structural decisions made early and revisited often that keep creating optionality. Every liquidity decision either opens doors for the next decade or it closes them. The goal is, how do you keep opening doors? So let's use an example of me and Ami in this situation, okay? So Ami and I are on, I think we're exactly like 35, 36 years apart. So we're very far from a generational perspective. I have a desire to significantly grow this business and do it very quickly. Ami would love to see that happen, but there's a problem. He also really wants liquidity. So what I and we are currently solving for is, how can I do both of these at the same time? The way that you can do that is, first, we have to figure out, okay, Ami, it's not going to be like the full exit number, but we got to get you something. So like there's a number that I have to get Ami. And I call that I get Ami off my back for a period of time number. I get him to a point where he is comfortable to say, yeah, let's go take that shot, because I'm not concerned any longer. If there has to be fluctuations, cool, because I got something that was very important to me up front. For me, that's really helpful, because then I can stop worrying from both a family and an operating perspective around all the constraints that exist whenever I know that I am responsible for him and my mother's well-being at the end of the day. Like if I screw this thing up, I've hurt my parents, irrevocably, potentially.
Plus your brothers and sisters.
Plus my brothers and sisters. Yes, exactly. So as we look at all of this, we went through our own view of, well, where do we really look at it? And then how does that actually fit with our growth strategy too? And we came up with a version that works really, really well for our family. And we are working on executing that plan right now. That same thought process, that same series of events that Ami and I went through over the past 2 years since I officially took over and we got to this point, it's not rocket science. Every single one of you can go through the same thing. I think one of the differences that him and I have is it's just him and I in the room talking. That does make it dramatically easier, but it doesn't mean that just because you have more family members, it becomes impossible.
Right. And that's the key. Again, you have to remember, depending upon who all the stakeholders are. And certainly with the founder and the next gen, just Brian and me, and then his brother and sister, it's a smaller entity. But the process still works. And it's the notion of trying to determine what it is that I want to accomplish, what it is that he wants to accomplish, and then what are those dangers, what are those opportunities, what are those strengths for that. And then in addition, one of the strategic byproducts, frankly, of this discussion enabled me to move into my favorite place, which is let me go out there and create something else. And so now we've been able to work with his younger brother and be able to build a similar but different type of a structure and strategy for family businesses that's separate from Interchange Capital Partners. So now I can continue to grow and develop as I want to. We can create some additional liquidity so my wife can feel more comfortable and everybody else can, but the operations of the business and the general growth of Baum Family Enterprises continues to grow and develop for generations to come because that's our legacy.
So 3 things to remember, and then David, we can turn over to any questions that we may have. Liquidity, structured well, can increase enterprise value. It removes family financial pressure from business decisions rather than draining the business of capital. Capital allocation is a repeatable framework, not a one-time call. We have to know what stays, what's available to extract, and what's conditional. And then family office infrastructure should match readiness, asset complexity, entity complexity, number of decision makers that are involved, horizon of cash flow or liquidity events. You don't want it to arrive too early and you don't want it to arrive too late. Those are the key areas that I want everyone to take away from this conversation. So thank everyone for joining us. And David, any questions? Sure.
There is a complex question. I've been trying to figure out how to make it shorter, but this person sees that friction between the operating capital needed by the business and the shareholder expectations for a reasonable ROI on their investment. Is there a tool or an idea that speaks to the financial expectations of shareholders, especially those who don't work in the business? Should they expect some kind of minimum cash ROI on the value of their ownership? It seems like a very complex area here.
Yeah, I mean, I would start by, and we see this a lot, and when we went back to, there's 4 interchanges: you, the family, the business, and the ownership. Too often, these financial decisions don't start with you. So the person who is getting the distributions and the person who's looking for the ROI has probably not done the work necessary to understand their own financial situation. And therefore, they're in some ways, just as we talked about the financial anxiety of the founder, there's a financial anxiety that exists with all the shareholders. And until that work is done to identify what that full balance sheet looks like with all the stakeholders, you're constantly going to be rubbing up against that. Once you can get that full balance sheet for the stakeholders at the U level, how they're handling their own personal finances, then all of a sudden opportunities open up for them to realize, oh, I could do this. Maybe we could, and optionality becomes the new program.
And the other piece I would mention, which is, how do I put this? The public data that is available in terms of returns of the S&P 500 or others. Everyone can see that. But what a lot of families don't do, I think a really great job of, is turning their own company into an actual thing that they can track over time and say, hey, look, our stock price was X and now it's Y. Well, here's the thing. I know people can do that. And I'm sure some of you are saying that we have done that, but you've depressed that stock value. You've given them the stock value of their estate plan, and no one likes that value. So you have not made it a real value for them. So until you turn to your stakeholders and say, look, this is our dividend yield. This is our fair market stock price. Here's how it is tracked and moved over time, year over year, quarter over quarter. And you can show, actually, we're paying out a dividend yield of 15%. Find me another company on the public markets that does that. You probably won't, but then I would also turn and say, if you're paying that much out, you're probably going the same route as my friend earlier in the story, because that was their company. You're paying out too much from a growth perspective. But you have to treat it like that too. And I think that the closer you get to reporting like you've got these stakeholders and you're trying to track this for them in a fair market way, I think that would help dramatically too.
Excellent. Well, that takes us to the bottom of the hour here. So I do want to thank you both yet again for a really insightful conversation. And it's always a pleasure to hear both of you talk about what you've been through and how your experiences are informing where you're taking the company as well. So thank you for that. Let's, in closing, if you're working on your liquidity issues, please join us for Transitions Fall, which will take place October 28th through 30th in Newport Beach, California. Brian and Ami and colleagues from Interchange Capital Partners will be there, so you can chat with them in person. Just scan the QR code that you see here for more details, and you can register at that website. I hope we'll see you and your colleagues there. I wish you all a great rest of your day and an excellent weekend. So thank you for your time and your attention.